Pack whatever fits in one bag. My mother needs that room by morning. That was how Gideon Strand, 43-year-old founder and CEO of Strand Hospitality Group, ended 11 years of marriage. Not with a conversation, not even with the decency of a closed door. Faye Lennox Strand, 37-year-old wife of Gideon and daughter of the late Arlen Lennox, stood in the main hallway of Cleardon House while her mother-in-law descended the staircase behind her husband like a coronation she had been rehearsing for years. Odeline Strand, 67-year-old mother of Gideon and managing trustee of the Strand Family Residential Trust, held a brass key between two fingers as if she were awarding a prize she had long promised herself. Behind her, near the upper landing, stood Reva Dawn, 29-year-old marketing director of Strand Hospitality Group, dressed in pale silk with a glass of wine she had not been offered by anyone in this house. She had simply taken it. Faye looked at her husband. He looked at the floor. 11 years. She had spent 11 years inside that house, making the Strand name sound better than the people carrying it. She had smoothed Odeline's insults before dinner guests noticed. She had renegotiated with vendors, Gideon offended with late payments. She had reviewed contracts at midnight, while Gideon slept soundly beside her, certain the business ran itself. She had recovered cash shortfalls from her own private accounts 3 times in 4 years without once saying the words, "You owe me," because she had believed marriage was not a ledger. Gideon did not believe any of that mattered tonight. "This isn't personal," he said, though everything about the way he said it was. Reva set her glass on the entry table, Faye's entry table, in Faye's house, and said softly, "Some women just aren't built for what comes next." Faye looked at her, not with fury, with the specific recognition of someone who had finally understood the shape of what she had been living inside. Odeline stepped forward and held out her open palm. The keys to Cleardon House sat there between them like a transaction. Faye placed them in her mother-in-law's hand without a word. Gideon cleared his throat. "A settlement offer comes by Monday. Don't make this complicated, Faye." She picked up the single bag she had packed. Not because she had wanted one bag, but because she had understood in the previous hour that this scene had been arranged long before tonight. Arguing about luggage would only make them feel righteous. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Reva say something low to Gideon. She heard him laugh. The night air was cold and the driveway was long. At the end of it, she stopped and looked back at Cleardon House. Every lit window was a room she had once believed belonged to her life. She turned away. What Gideon did not know, what he had never bothered to know, was that Faye Lennox Strand carried a name he had mistaken for irrelevant. Her father, Arlen Lennox, had not simply been a lawyer. He had built Lennox & Associates into one of the most respected commercial contracts firms in the state, a firm that drafted, held, and serviced binding agreements for businesses across 3 counties. When Arlen died, controlling interest in the firm passed through the Lennox Family Trust, a private trust established before his marriage, protected under her maiden name in documents Gideon had signed during their premarital disclosure review and dismissed as old family paperwork. He had laughed at the packet, called it lawyer paranoia, signed without reading past page 2. He did not know that Lennox & Associates had drafted every foundational contract in Strand Hospitality Group's 11-year history, every venue lease, every liquor license renewal, every anchor clause in the financing package supporting his upcoming expansion. 3 new event venues Gideon planned to open before summer, deals that had taken 2 years to negotiate and hinged on agreements already in preparation at a firm he casually called our outside counsel. His outside counsel was his wife's firm. He did not know, because he had never thought to ask why Lennox was the name on the letterhead. He had assumed, in the arrogant way of men who stopped paying attention, that it was simply a firm his people had always used. He had shaken hands with their senior partners at holiday events. He had signed documents they prepared without reading past the signature line. The word Lennox had passed in front of his eyes hundreds of times across 11 years, and not once had he connected it to the woman who cooked dinner across the table from him and whose father's name he had laughed at on a premarital disclosure form. Some blindness is not accidental. It is chosen carefully by people who prefer not to be surprised. The hotel room was quiet in the way only rented rooms become quiet. No history in the walls, no weight in the furniture. Faye sat at the small desk with her laptop open and her father's reading glasses, the one she always carried in her bag, resting beside the keyboard. She was not crying yet. The call came before 10. Odette Fairfax, 51-year-old private litigation attorney, and one of 3 people Arlen Lennox had told his daughter to trust if love ever became a legal problem, spoke without preamble. I'm 40 minutes away. Do not open the settlement until I'm there. Faye did not argue. When Odette arrived, she looked at the room the way experienced attorneys looked at every unfamiliar scene, noting what was missing, not only what was present. She sat across from Faye, read the settlement in silence, and turned to page 4 without comment. She pointed to a single clause and set the document flat on the table between them. Faye read it. Wife acknowledges that she holds no direct or indirect ownership, interest, or advisory relationship with any law firm, legal entity, or contracted counsel currently providing services to Strand Hospitality Group, and waives all rights to review, challenge, or participate in any legal or contractual matter connected to said business operations. Faye set the paper down. That clause, Odette said, is not a divorce protection. That is a man who has just discovered he has a problem and is trying to make you sign it away before you understand the problem belongs to you to solve. Faye was quiet for a moment, then, how do we proceed? Odette opened her leather case and placed a legal pad on the table. Carefully, completely, and with every document your father left you. Faye had known something was wrong inside Strand Hospitality Group for longer than Gideon would ever admit. She had seen it first nearly 2 years ago. Vendor invoices processed twice, then marked corrected in ways that moved money sideways rather than back. She had noticed it in Hollis Breck, 55-year-old chief financial officer of Strand Hospitality Group, and the man Gideon trusted with numbers he did not fully understand. Hollis carried the specific nervousness of someone managing a figure he had never shown anyone on a single clean sheet. She had raised it once, gently over dinner the way she raised everything, softly enough not to threaten, clearly enough to be honest. Gideon had told her she didn't understand corporate finance. She understood it better than anyone in that house. She had grown up watching her father review contracts the way other fathers read bedtime stories, out loud, carefully, with explanations. By the time she was 22, she could spot a covenant breach in a lease renewal faster than most junior associates. But she had learned slowly, and then all at once, that Gideon's confidence was structural. If she corrected him too precisely, he stopped listening entirely. So she had kept her own records in a small notebook she carried in her bag, dates, discrepancies, amounts, and the dates she had mentioned them and the dates he had dismissed her. The notebook was in the bag she had packed. The morning after leaving Cleardon House, she drove to the firm's administrative offices and walked in through the side entrance. The one she had used since childhood, the one that still had the small brass plaque her father had mounted at the door height of a 10-year-old. She sat across from Clement Rowe, 64-year-old senior managing partner of Lennox & Associates, and the man who had worked beside Arlen Lennox for 26 years. Clement set a folder on the table before she asked. The expansion package, he said. They submitted the final contracts for preparation last week. 3 new venue leases, 2 supplier agreements, 1 anchor financing addendum. He paused. They expect execution within 30 days. Faye looked at the top page. Strand Hospitality Group's expansion. The one Gideon had been celebrating for 2 years, the one that was going to triple their footprint, the one he had apparently been planning to complete with Reva beside him, and Faye's name nowhere in his future. What happens, she asked, if we discover a conflict of interest in the existing contract history before the new agreements are executed? Clement's voice was measured. We have an ethical obligation to pause, disclose, and refer any implicated matters to independent review before proceeding. And if the existing contracts contain material misrepresentations, then we have an obligation to the record. Faye looked at her father's name on the wall behind him. Pull everything, every contract we've held for Strand, every amendment, renewal, and side letter. I want it reviewed by an independent team before we prepare anything further. Clement nodded slowly. Are you all right, Faye? She picked up the folder. I'm becoming all right. The settlement conference was held in a rented room 3 days later. Gideon arrived in a suit that said he had already won. His attorney, Percival Mounts, 58-year-old private divorce litigator, sat beside him with a leather folder and the practiced calm of someone who charged enough to perform patience. Odeline entered last, wearing pale grey and the expression she wore when she was certain a room had already been arranged to her advantage. Reva was not required to attend. She came anyway. She sat behind Gideon wearing a gold necklace. Faye recognized, not because she had ever worn it herself, but because she had watched Gideon take it from the velvet case in Cleardon's private safe the week before Faye's birthday the previous year, and it had never appeared. She had assumed she had been wrong about the date. She had assumed many things. Odette slid the settlement back across the table without opening it. My client declines. Percival adjusted his posture. The offer is quite generous given that Mrs. Strand has no independent business interests or income of record. Odette smiled without warmth. Then you won't mind explaining why the settlement specifically references legal counsel. The room shifted. Gideon's jaw tightened. Hollis, who had entered quietly as a financial representative, went still near the far wall. Standard language, Percival said. Odette turned to Faye. Faye looked at her husband for the first time since she had left Cleardon House. He looked different under flat conference room light. Smaller, somehow. Not in size, in certainty. You've used Lennox & Associates for 11 years, Faye said. You signed the premarital disclosure that named the Lennox Family Trust. You laughed at it and handed it back without finishing page 2. Gideon's face changed. Odeline's did not, which meant she had already suspected and chosen to proceed anyway. Lennox & Associates, Odette said to the room, is the firm operating under the Lennox Family Trust. Faye Lennox Strand is the controlling beneficiary of that trust. She maintained a careful professional wall between her marriage and all firm decisions involving Strand Hospitality Group. That wall has been made untenable by a settlement demanding she sign away her professional identity. Percival turned to Gideon. Something wordless moved between them. Gideon leaned forward, his voice dropped, not to cruelty this time, to something closer to fear in a suit. Faye, we don't need to do this in front of people. You ended our marriage in front of your mother and your girlfriend, she said. In my own hallway. He had nothing for that. She stood and gathered her folder. The firm will pause all active Strand matters pending independent conflict review. If the existing contracts contain what I believe they contain, your expansion will not close on your timeline. Reva spoke from behind Gideon's chair. You're destroying a company out of bitterness. Faye looked at her. I'm reviewing a legal file out of obligation. What's inside it was there before I looked. She walked out. The independent review took 8 days. Clement led it alongside 2 outside attorneys with no prior connection to either family. What they found was not the collapse itself. It was the scaffolding of a collapse that had been dressed in clean paperwork for years. 3 vendor contracts had been inflated beyond original scope with routing that moved excess payments into an account traced to Reva Dawn's consulting invoices. A liquor license renewal bore board approval signatures that didn't match those on record, and the expansion financing addendum, the one Gideon needed signed before his lender would release the capital, required clean title certification on all existing properties. Clean title certification had to come from Lennox & Associates. Because Lennox & Associates held the title records. The firm could not certify title while an active conflict review was open. The expansion could not close without certification. When Clement set the findings on the conference room table, he placed the folder with both hands, the careful weight of a person who understands what he is carrying. Faye looked at the summary. She thought about Gideon standing in the hallway of Cleardon House, with his hands in his pockets, telling her not to make things complicated. She thought about the gold necklace. She thought about her father's voice on the night before she married. Don't give your name away to someone who doesn't understand what it carries. She had thought he meant her sense of self, the kind of speech fathers give when they fear losing their daughters. He had meant the name on the letterhead. What do you recommend? She asked. Full disclosure to all active parties, referral of suspected fraud concerns to independent counsel, formal notice to the lender that title certification is paused. And the employees, Faye said, the venue staff, the event coordinators, the people who set the chairs and manage the bookings. Clement looked at her. They didn't sign the inflated contracts, she said. What happens to them if the expansion fails and the existing operations follow? They will need transition support. Then that comes first, she said, before the lender notices, before anything becomes public. I want an employee assistance plan active before the first filing goes out. Clement was quiet. Then, you are very much your father's daughter. Faye picked up the findings. Send the disclosure notices, she said. Gideon received his copy on a Tuesday. He called Faye 6 times. She did not answer. Odette handled every call. By Wednesday, the lender had issued a formal pause on the expansion financing. By Thursday, one vendor had filed a demand for full audit access. By Friday, Hollis Breck had retained his own attorney, separate from Gideon's, and requested a cooperation agreement with the fraud review. He did not do it to help Faye. He did it because cooperation is what people choose when the alternative is going down with a ship they didn't build. Gideon called once more on Friday evening, not through counsel, directly. Thre let it ring 4 times. His voice had changed. The practiced ease was gone. What remained was honest in the way that surfaces only when everything else has been used up. "You could have just signed," he said. "You could have just told me the truth," she said. Silence. "I thought you'd never find out." Thre looked at the thin curtains of her hotel room, her father's glasses on the desk, the small notebook full of dates he'd dismissed, sitting beside the lamp. "That's what hurt most," she said, "not the rest of it. The fact that after 11 years, you still thought I wasn't capable of finding out." She ended the call. 3 weeks later, Strand Hospitality Group entered emergency restructuring proceedings. 2 of the 3 venue leases could not execute without title certification. The anchor lender withdrew. A secondary lender issued a cross-default notice. The venues that had spent years operating on borrowed stability began to feel the floor they had been standing on. Payroll flagged on a Thursday. Vendors called on a Friday. By Monday, the company Gideon had introduced at industry dinners, as built from discipline and vision, had filed for protection. The ground had always been borrowed. Odeline tried to manage the news from inside Cleardon House, calling board members and using words like temporary restructuring and outside interference. But investors who ask questions already know. The answers aren't what they were promised, and no amount of measured language changes a default notice into a misunderstanding. Rava disappeared quietly. She had been making arrangements for herself before the disclosure notices arrived, which suggested she had understood the risk before Gideon did, or at least understood it differently. The consulting contract she expected to convert into a permanent leadership role in the expanded group was gone. The invoices the audit had flagged, personal expenses misclassified as business costs, a pattern that ran back nearly 2 years, were now part of a formal review she could not negotiate around. The gold necklace was returned in a padded envelope by her attorney. Thre was not there to see it arrive. She had stopped measuring her recovery by what they lost. The divorce was finalized on a grey morning in late March. Odette read the judgment. The court acknowledged Gideon's pattern of financial concealment, rejected his characterizations of Thre as having contributed nothing substantive to the marriage, and recognized the firm's conflict review as professional obligation rather than spousal interference. The Lennox family trust remained intact. The firm remained under her name. What was marital was divided without a hidden clause and without a gag attached. Thre sat in the courthouse parking lot for a long time afterward without starting the car. A message arrived from Clement, Transition Fund active, 63 former venue employees enrolled in the first week. Job placement contacts confirmed. She read it twice. Then she started the car. She returned to Cleardon House only once, months later, to retrieve documents from the estate's administrative files. A receiver had made the arrangements. A schedule had been set. The house looked the same from the outside. Houses like that always did from a distance. Inside, the entry hall was quieter. The chandelier still distributed light across the marble in the same patterns it always had. But the staff moved without performance now. Not around her the way they had when Odeline owned every corridor, but simply like people doing their work without an audience. Della, 58-year-old head of household staff at Cleardon House, met her at the door. Della had worked there for 19 years. She had never once been thanked by name in a company report or a board summary. Twice, when Gideon's payroll had nearly missed the household account, it had been Thre who had quietly arranged the bridge payment so that no one's check arrived late. Della held the door open and said, "We knew." Just that, no subject specified, no explanation needed. Thre put her hand briefly on Della's arm. "I know," she said. She collected what she had come for and left without walking through the rooms. There was nothing in them she needed to reclaim. The things that mattered, her father's glasses, the notebook, the trust documents, the name on the letterhead, she had carried out herself the night they handed her one bag and told her she was no longer who this family needed. She drove to the firm without planning to. It was past closing when she arrived, but her key still worked. She walked through the empty reception area without turning on the overhead lights. The frosted glass offices held the faint blue of streetlight. Her father's nameplate was still mounted in the corridor. Brass, simple. A. Lennox, founding partner. She stopped in front of it. She thought about Gideon laughing at the premarital disclosure form and handing it back, unsigned, past page 2. She thought about how long she had wanted to believe that laugh meant he loved her without accounting. freely, the way people love when they're not performing it. She thought about how many times she had translated his carelessness into something more bearable because the alternative had been too hard to name. She set her hand flat against the nameplate. Don't give your name away to someone who doesn't understand what it carries. He had never understood. That was not a verdict, and it was not forgiveness. It was simply the true shape of what had happened. He had looked at her father's name on contracts for 11 years and never once wondered why it sounded familiar. Some people do not see what they choose not to see. She turned on the light in her office and sat down at her desk. Her real desk, the one that had always been hers, facing the window that looked out over the street where her father used to park an old blue car before dawn because he said the best thinking happened before the phone started. She opened her laptop. She had work to do, not to recover from Gideon, not to demonstrate that she had survived. There were 63 people in a transition fund whose next steps needed attention, 2 junior associates who deserved to know their caseloads would not be abandoned, and a dozen active files that had been on careful pause while her personal life became a legal matter. She worked until the street outside went quiet. At some point she realized the thing she had been waiting to feel, the relief, the weightlifting, the specific release of something that had been pressing down for years, had already arrived. She had not noticed because it had not come in a single moment. It had come in pieces, in Clement's voice when he said she was her father's daughter, in Della holding the door, in Odette pointing to a clause and calling it something other than language, in the small notebook full of dates that had been dismissed by one person and believed by the record. She had not waited to be believed. She had kept the record. She had protected the name. She had stayed exactly where she was, doing exactly what she had always done, until the day the name on the letterhead became impossible to ignore. Faye Lennox closed her laptop, put on her coat, and walked out into the cool air of a city that had never needed her to announce herself. It had only needed her to know her own name. She had always known it. The rest of the world had only now caught up.